Hi, I'm Dajana Yoakley. I'm a peaceful parenting coach and mom of three, and I am delighted to give you the latest science backed research on child development, parenting, and to support you in showing up as the parent that you want to be. Welcome. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Delight in Parenting podcast. I'm Dajana Yoakley, your host, and I'm really delighted to have here with me Will Kirsop. Welcome, Will. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Dana, delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming back. I know you were on one of my summits not too long ago, and it was a great interview and discussion about particularly teenagers. So I know your work involves working with teens. And so I'll tell you guys a little bit about Will before we get into our topic for the day. So Will is an education leader and the founder of Many Roads, where he coaches teenagers and young adults to discover their purpose and thrive. With a background spanning education, psychology, and business, Will saw a gap in how many young people are supported in discovering their unique path. His coaching blends evidence-based methodologies, behavioral and cognitive psychology, real-world strategy to help teens build confidence and direction for their future. Will holds a commerce degree from the University of Sydney and a psychology degree from Swinburne University, where he was awarded the 2024 University Medal as the most outstanding undergraduate student across the entire university. That's amazing. He has also completed executive education at UC Berkeley. An avid surfer, meditator, and lifelong learner, he is passionate about leveraging his professional life and life experiences to help students navigate purpose and well-being. So I'm so excited to have you back. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here. And I always just like to start by saying as well, yeah, just a big shout out to all the parents and educators tuning in. It's just always like so amazing to see the dedication and commitment and how you all show up in your various ways and just you guys being here and listening to the show. So really big thank you and
Yeah.
excited to dive in.
Yeah, it definitely takes a village, and parents listening to the podcast are obviously motivated to become to stay a lifelong learner, to become a lifelong learner and supporting their children. And our conversation today, we're going to really zoom in on parents of teenagers or educators that work with teenagers, because I know you work with teens day in and day out. And so you're like in the thick of it and you understand how they think. And so today we're going to talk about this. In the United States, it is still back to school time, but I know you're in Australia, so it's a little bit of a different season. But these concepts around in academics, in the school system, teenagers in the school environment, we're going to talk about compassion, metacognition, executive function, how they serve as some core pillars, and explore ideas related to teens' purpose and self-identity and motivation to achieve their goals academically and then career-wise, professionally, because they are really on this cusp of transitioning into the adult world, which can be very uncertain and gray, and I'm sure anxiety provoking for many teens. So yeah, if you'd like to elaborate there.
Yeah, it's definitely a big time. And as you mentioned, we're recording around the time that many students in the US are maybe back at school or just about to start going back to school, and it can be a pretty foundational time. And I'm quite lucky my coaching straddles mainly Australia as well as the US. So I have the privilege of working with some students who are about to get back to school, and then in the thick
Yeah.
of it, some of my support in Australia. And I guess one of the big things that's probably been coming up for me lately is working on academic strategy. So with high school students, helping them think and mobilize towards some of their goals from an academic standpoint. And it's probably highlighted, I guess, just the importance of I guess, metacognitive, so the thinking about thinking type of skills, as well as executive function. So I guess, the cognitive kind of control processes that manage thoughts, emotions, and behavior. So it's thinking about, like, on the metacognitive side, like what's the awareness and choices strategies from an academic standpoint, mobilizing towards a goal. And then on the other side, from executive function, like their actual capacities to, I guess, carry out those strategies. So their working memory, their inhibition controls, so we can talk maybe about phones and things of that nature, and
Yes.
cognitive flexibility as well.
So we're really helping them develop this, I guess, kind of like you're saying, two different distinct processes. One is like, who am I and what do I want and what does this look like and how do I think about it? How do I um, like how do I decide what I want to choose, I guess. Kind of those like more abstract. And then the other, and I'm not specifically talking about like getting good grades, but it's related to everything, right? It's academics, but it's also like identity. It's about choices with career, like focus, but also like studying for a test or
Mhm.
applying to a certain university, whatever. And then the other part is what you're saying, like, is the nitty gritty of how do I actually like accomplish this goal? How do I get from A to Z? How do I make that kind of ideal real with the executive function skills like planning, executing, working
Yeah.
memory, like you said, remembering to do things, impulse control, etc. So how do
Yeah,
you work with
absolutely.
students to, yeah, go ahead. Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, even before the metacognitive, because I guess the metacognitive can still be around like how do I learn best? So there's, and that is
Mhm.
reflecting and things of that nature. But even before that, there's probably this thinking about like purpose and motivation. And one big thing that's actually been coming up in my practice lately and I've been working with students on is actually just thinking about flow and helping them encourage them to think of like when's a time you've been really immersed in something. When's a time that you've been really absorbed, that you've lost track of time, let's say. And we can look at it in different contexts. It can be in the fun or the hobbies bucket, and it can also be in an academic context. So maybe to provide a couple of examples, I did a reflective writing piece just earlier this week with a student around flow, and he talked about how like he really likes to surf, and he actually talked about like that feeling of like pulling up to the surf with his friends, or like calling them after school, and they like bike down and go check the waves, and that feeling of excitement, and then they're like, you know, rushing out together to like try and get out there and almost like a race, and then what we were able to do, like we in this reflective writing piece, like getting to the next layer of detail, is that he was able to identify that like there's a fun, healthy kind of competition with his friends, but also the camaraderie is something that he really enjoys. So that was a way to start reflecting on like what are some of the things that underpin flow for him. And then separately, another student who I've been working with over the summer, they actually identified that writing essays and like being just in a creative mindset, maybe a little bit of music on that's non-verbal, really can get them in the zone, and that kind of time can absorb away in like a more academic context. So I guess for parents out there, I think that can be a really neat way to help, you know, starting to have these conversations around purpose or identity development, and you know, like trying to observe like where does your teen lose track of time. And I know for like tons of parents, they'll say like, you know, when my you know, daughter or my son was younger, they love playing Lego is like a really common one that, you know, you'll often hear, but it might be gaming, it might be art, it could be sport, it could be reading, it could be really anything at all. So that's like a really good place to start. And I
Mhm.
guess that's almost the precursor to then having those, you know, metacognitive and executive function and like the execution conversations.
Yeah, I like that in terms of like identifying passions and figuring out like what do you particularly like enjoy doing, I guess. One of the challenges I wonder though if parents, like you meant, you touched on it, but the artificial dopamine that they get from social media, video games, is how similar is that to the state of flow of like building Legos or writing? And does it like those types of activities, how hard is it going to be for teens to even identify it when they're so exposed to electronics and technology nowadays? Do they even have opportunity for flow? Some of them, you know, like,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
a really good question. I guess like flow is probably like popularized or pioneered by the, you know, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and I guess there's like three elements from probably like a research standpoint. So the concentration, the interest and enjoyment. And I guess that one might argue that if there's these huge dopamine spikes going on, if they're quite short term, I don't know if they're watching YouTube Shorts or TikTok or you know
Mhm.
whatever the case may be, that it's probably not in a flow state because there's so much rapid change, and so there's maybe possibly not that prolonged concentration. The reason why I actually mentioned gaming specifically as an
Yeah.
example because I think that, and you know what I hear from students as well is that they're just like fully immersed, and like you know students who really like gaming, they're really in that zone, and in some ways it's no different to like an art or a craft activity or writing or reading or
Mhm.
participating in sport. And some of those elements actually come online. Even when we go back to the example I used earlier of like the competition can come online, the camaraderie can come online as well. So it's not
Yeah.
to encourage like endless gaming. I'm certainly not encouraging that, but it's helping
Right. Right.
in what some of those things might look like. So yeah, really trying to think about
Hmm.
it as like a much more immersive experience is how I would try and conceptualize
Hmm.
experience.
Yeah, yeah. And I know we had, as we're talking about thinking about topics, I mean, even AI, can be very immersive. I mean, it's designed that way, right? Just to touch a little bit more on technology and even virtual reality,
Yeah.
gaming, or whatever, like um, even Minecraft. I mean, Minecraft
Yeah.
has so many,
Huge.
creative mode has so many benefits too,
Yeah.
um, related to different functions of the brain. So there's definitely similarities between those types of experiences and the place when I always think about flow is like runners.
Yeah.
Runners and like the runner's
Runners high.
high and they're like, right, like the flow state. Um, but I guess
So
part
just
of it
maybe
is,
on that actually, just because you
yeah,
mentioned Minecraft, I just couldn't resist. So
yeah,
tons of work with like love Minecraft, which is classic.
yeah.
One of them actually realized that there was like a game book that he'd read and he found like basically an error in the game. And he got like super excited about it and started showing me all about this error in the game. And what he actually decided to do was create a YouTube channel off the back of it to like demonstrate these like errors in like this rule book or this game and
Uh-huh.
really like I guess bring that to the world. And like obviously there's a I guess a genre of people who put themselves playing on YouTube and all these different things. So I guess it's like a
Hmm.
really interesting way for a student to expand upon like an interest or a passion and start to bring it to life in some form of like personal project that's helping them with some of these executive function skills because they have to think about, okay, well, how do I do voiceovers? How do I screen record? How do I put that into a video? How do I upload it? How do I build subscribers? How do I get clicks on my channel?
Hmm.
Things of that nature. So yeah, that's maybe like an actionable way to bring that to life.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I love that. And those can translate if they're working on something that they are passionate about, maybe outside of school hours, and they're having to use some executive function skills. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a classic like thing about preteen boys, like they all want to be famous YouTubers, but they don't have the executive function skills to actually achieve that, right? They just think like you can turn a switch on and I'll be famous, I'll make
Yeah.
millions of dollars, everybody's gonna know my name, which sounds great, but like and it's fine if some of them want to do that, that's fine, but to get there it requires a lot of steps. And so I
Yeah.
guess if they're exercising that process, it's a benefit because you can then use those same pathways in academics too, like okay, right, like you get
Abs
it's transferable skills.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's regardless of whether it's, wanting to be a big YouTuber, like oftentimes to some degree the goal might be known of, wanting to perform a certain way in a test or, build a YouTube channel and get to a certain subscriber number and that there's like this, A at the start and then there's this B kind of goal. And what I tend to find is that there's this challenge, and this even goes for older students in, say, 11th grade or 12th grade, that it can be hard to break down the individual constituents of the goal to go from A all the way through to B. So let's say it's a YouTube channel and they want to like upload a dozen videos and like actually starting to help them scaffold like what are the individual videos going to look like, what's the content, what's the theme, when are they going to do it by, how long's the editing going to take, things of that nature. And then similarly with academics, it can get to the end of the year whether it's US Common Core, whether it's APs, or different education systems really around the world, that it can be difficult to break down all of the subject matter and all of the different elements and I guess the syllabus into these bite-sized chunks, sorry, that students can then mobilize and move forward and go through this whole scheme of like, starting to write notes and comprehend the content, starting to do practice questions, starting to, I guess, do past papers, to do questions without notes, to, do flashcards, all of these different like practice elements along the way. So I guess distilling that point B and breaking all those components down can be quite challenging for students, even in the older years. So that's something that I've found can really, really move the needle from an academic standpoint. And I just had a student the other day, and they just said, um, the easy part's actually studying. The hard part is figuring out like what to study. And that was really a crystallizing moment for me because they just had felt they're going through a bunch of exams in Australia at the moment and they finished two on a Thursday, Friday back to back, two English papers, had a weekend, and then they had two on the Monday, Tuesday. And they said, I just felt this huge sense of relief at Friday lunchtime that we'd already created a plan for the weekend. I know what I needed to do, and they didn't need to use, I guess, these cognitive processes to try and figure that out on top of trying to learn all of these different things.
Hmm. Yeah, I think what you're talking about is still relatable even for adults. I mean, these are functions that many times in adulthood ourselves, like we might struggle with, right? Like
Mm,
overwhelmed, like I'm so overwhelmed. Well, why are you overwhelmed? Well, because there's too much to do and not enough time. Well, how are we thinking through this, right? Like, are we prioritizing? Do you think you have to do everything? What's most important? Right? Like, these are all these executive function skills, and not every adult is at the same competency level. And some
yeah,
adults, I mean, have challenges with executive function, you know, including ADHD and other things, and undiagnosed, right? So,
yeah,
you know, and some of these kids also obviously could have a diagnosis of executive function challenges or not, but it's still something that we want to support at any kind of
yeah,
level. And as I was thinking about that, you know, let's say that an adult does have those skills, a
mhm,
parent has those skills, but what is the best way to approach a teen about it? 'Cause sometimes I think teens are like, I'll just figure it out myself. I'll just do it myself. But then comes out the other side and it's like that didn't go well. Now the grades are suffering. So how can parents like insert themselves without pushing the teen away and without being too controlling, because nobody likes to be controlled even if they need help. Yeah.
yeah. Sure, sure. And just on the first point you made, Diana, around
Mhm.
not being maybe perfect, whether it's in executive function or any domain, and it's kind of a neat, you know, capture of like how we can actually be compassionate and self-compassionate because we're never going to be perfect in the way we show up with teens, as you know, in whichever way we might work with them. And I actually think modeling some of these skills can be really important. So it's like saying, "Hey, I was planning to do this on, Sunday afternoon, and I thought it was going to take an hour, but it took three." And actually like sharing that and starting to model that self-compassion can be really important and it can help develop things like resilience and things of that nature.
Mhm.
That's something to consider. In terms of, I guess, the scaffolding around supporting teens,
Yeah.
and yeah, there's of course there's this boundary, I guess, where we need to kind of set boundaries, but we also want to be warm and supportive and things of that nature. Every teen or every student's going to be quite different and responding to different things. What I've found that can be quite effective is supporting with developing like a calendar or plan for the week. And again, kind of with around the going back to school time in the US, it can be a really neat time to try and consider this. And this can work from, the middle school age group all the way up. And what I tend to find is that if you Google Calendar works really well, but some prefer physical calendar, and this isn't going to be necessary for everyone, but we can try testing and until the right system
Mhm.
comes online. But in that sitting down and just like supporting your daughter or your son or whoever it may be you're
Mhm.
working with to actually go and map out their week. So you might say, we leave home at this time each day and putting that recurring from Monday to Friday, block out the time of school, block out, however they might get home, and then starting to block out the commitments if they've got sport or art and craft or music or whatever the case may be after school. And then quickly you see like there's actually already probably not that much white space in a calendar. And if you add,
Right.
different on the weekend, family time, other commitments. So then you can start saying, well, hey, it's important for, them to have their own time to themselves, for socializing, for friends, and all of those things, but they also might have
Mhm.
other commitments in terms of academics and things like that. And actually, I often like to empower them and say, like, well, what do you think is the appropriate amount of time, and how would you like to start structuring your time? So, what I tend to find works really well, and I tend to encourage is coming home after school, like having a break, chilling out. Like I've had a student, this was actually quite a while ago, and he was like, "Oh, Will, like he's quite academically inclined. He's like, oh, Will, like I just come home and like I want to do homework, but I find myself on YouTube and I just never stop." And then it was like, hey, well, what's the right amount of time? Like you naturally want to come home. It's been a big day. You might want to unwind, have a snack, chill out for a bit. And he's like, I want to do 25 minutes because after like 30, it's too long. And then so he kind of blocked that out in his calendar and then was able to start, let's say like 4 or 4:30, whichever the time was, to start, getting into his homework and the other priorities that they had. So I think that can work
Mhm.
really well. And that actually provides this wrapper because on one hand, like let's say on the Sunday or whichever day of the week it is, but You can do the more like metacognitive reflection. So starting to think about like what went well, what might you like to tweak in this coming week? And then you can actually integrate those executive function skills in terms of planning for the week ahead. So it's a really neat way to straddle both of
Mm.
those things.
Yeah, I like that because you're giving them a tool, um, and you're helping them make their own decisions, which I
Yeah.
think is really important, that autonomy.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that they feel like there's a book by Ned Johnson and Dr. William Stixford called Self-Driven Child. I love that book for particularly teenagers and college age kids. And it's for parents, but again, like it talks about this idea of we want them to be the driver. And they're in the United States, they drive at 16. But with these other decisions, like it is their life eventually, and soon they're going to be doing this solo.
Yeah.
So we have to help them practice. Um, what if though they start to like if let's say instead of 25 minutes, the kid says like, well, maybe 2 hours, and the parents like, that's not gonna go well. How do you kind of give feedback about that without controlling it?
Well, I guess the good thing about it's almost like a negotiation, right? So if they put the point first, you kind of know where they stand. And what I always like to say, and we know it's backed up pretty heavily in the literature, that you know, teens actually really, really crave boundaries. They just want to push against them. So you kind of just can then try and insert a boundary and try and make a compromise. And I actually also think a huge thing is like educating teens on what's going on. And let's say they say, okay, I want to do 2 hours of gaming or 2 hours of social media. And
YouTubing before I start my
yeah,
homework. I think about 2 hours is right, from 4 to 6. Yeah.
and like sharing with them, like, hey, if where we keep it in that bucket of those type of activities, that's going to spike their dopamine like super, super high. And then you can say, well, are you really going to be excited to do after 2 hours of YouTube? How do you think you're going to feel? We're going to have dinner at that time. And then after it, I'm going to be asking you to start your algebra homework or, writing an essay on classical literature. How excited are you really going to be doing that compared to being on that dopamine spike? So
Mm-hmm.
that's what we can try and have like an informed conversation and empowering teenagers with a little bit more like data and information about how they might use their time. And
Yeah.
just back to the point you made at the start of that as well is like the what you mentioned about being like, independent and shifting up into adulthood and becoming like independent. I mean, that's like the core of, adolescence and where we're trying to scaffold teenagers to get to, right? And so becoming that independent decision maker is super important. And that's why the metacognition, I personally think, and the thesis that I've really got at the moment is like in 10 years' time with AI and tech and everything that's going on, one of the biggest skills or the biggest currency is actually going to be our ability to learn because we really don't know what technology is going to look like and the different skills that we're going to need to level up in down the future. So down the line. So developing these metacognitive skills, understanding how I learn best, in what ways that is going to be really, really important. And so starting to help empower teenagers to do that is really going to actually set them up for their futures in a really cool way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and to tag onto that, critical thinking is another huge skill that we have to help them develop, right? Especially with AI and
Mhm.
information overload. There's
Yeah,
so much information, it's hard to figure out, first of all, what to like even look at. And secondly, like what is true and what's not,
yeah,
or what's for me and what's not. 'Cause sometimes there seems to be multiple truths, depending on who you ask. So how do we help them build these critical thinking skills too?
yeah. And I'm not sure if you saw that recent MIT study, which talks about how, I guess over reliance on tools like ChatGPT can actually suppress critical thinking skills. And so
I
I think
did
that,
see that. They did some studies like 4 to 6 months after or something. People
yeah,
thought less critically with their own brain because it was
yes.
easy to just use ChatGPT.
Yeah. Again, I know that was with a cohort of adults, but you just only wonder what it could be if it gets, I guess, applied to teenagers. So it's interesting you mentioned analytical thinking because recently the World Economic Forum earlier this year actually surveyed like thousands of businesses, thousands of leaders about what are the core skills right now in 2025 and what do they project some of the core skills being in 2030. And some really interesting things came up. Critical thinking was actually second on the list. I found interestingly, motivation and self awareness was right up there at the top, as well as empathy and active listening. So it's very interesting in my
Wow.
eyes to hear what are the skills that we should be helping teens think about and identify that these things are actually a skill. Like, even if, is motivation a skill? It's really interesting that that's framed in that way. But Look, analytical thinking, one thing I actually like to do is try and contextualize the curriculum or the education system for students where I can. So, they might roll their eyes and say, well, why do I have to do Ours to Trig? Or why do I have to learn, this classical text or Shakespeare? And so it might be, well, let's try and think about what, I guess, careers might use, say, persuasive skills or negotiation skills. And you might come up with things like being a lawyer or being in a sales role or a real estate agent or all these different skills. And so that's actually why you're learning to write persuasive essays at this point in time. And you might apply these skills in different ways as you write emails, as you write proposals, different things of that nature. Similarly, on the, I guess, critical thinking side from, a more math oriented standpoint, it could be engineering pathways and things of that nature as well. So those are some of the skills that can work quite well. And then I think just touching on AI and ChatGPT, like I think it's really great for students to use these skills. Say like Grammarly, I think is really, really powerful. And
Yes.
this whole next generation, the spell check, they like even I've been fortunate to work with some very, very bright and gifted students. Honestly, over 90% use spell check. It's really surprising how many of them do rely on that. So helping them with tools like Grammarly, but helping them try and use Grammarly in a way, let's say, that they can actually reflect on, what's a comma splice, and then starting to use that actively in their work can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's like you talked about earlier, teaching them to learn, how to learn, not necessarily the content. The content's always changing, but it's one thing, the motivate. I love that you're touching on these like kind of global analyses. The motivation to learn, which I think is like when people say I'm a lifelong learner, that's a source of motivation, right? You're motivated by learning for whatever reason, like somehow you're drawn to it inherently, like internal motivation, right? Lifelong learner. So how do we teach them the skills to become a learner for life? And my guess is role modeling and exposure, but we can talk about that. And then the second thing is like learning. So if you know what you want to learn about, how do you then build the skills to learn? I had also heard, I don't know if you can like elaborate on this, but often kids like throughout the public school system, at least in the United States, it's like memorization, and testing on the memorization, but they don't really get taught skills to study. And then they get to
Mhm.
college and they don't know how to study because nobody taught them to study. It was just like data dump and then
Yeah.
extraction of data versus this whole thing we're talking about. So I guess, I mean, we're kind of talking about that in general anyway in this call, but if you have any more tips on how to prepare, I guess particularly high schoolers, although I probably should start earlier, for something like college or whatever the next level is of where you have to study on independently without mom and dad there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point. And there are definitely some tools and strategies I could talk about that probably work quite neatly. One of them that I always just like to actually start with is for a lot of students, and I think that we know when we talk about like attention and challenges like that is something called the Pomodoro method. And effectively, it's 25 minutes of super focused study with a 5-minute break. And that can work really, really well. And the conversation that I actually tend to find that I have with students is, um, you can do 25 minutes, your phone's out of the room, you're not on, any other distractions. That can feel quite achievable. And then they get the 5-minute break and they get the snack of either going and having some food or they get the dopamine snack that they want to look at on their phone. And it works actually well for a couple of reasons. One, sometimes, students do have like FOMO of missing out on the group chat or wanting to text their friends and everything like that. And it's like the conversations tend to feel approachable, of, okay, yeah, I can go without the group chat for 25 minutes. It's not going to be the end of the world at lunchtime tomorrow or in the playground. I'm not going to miss out. But secondly, and I had this quite recently, I had a student who needed to write an essay on Shakespeare and Margaret Atwood's The Hag's Head. And I often find like just getting started is like the hardest part. And I was like, hey, can you just commit to me of doing one Pomodoro and just spending 25 minutes? I don't want you to spend a minute more than 25, just spend 25. And they did it. And then they texted me, we're like, yeah, it's like so much easier. Just like I've just got over the hump. So I think that's something that can work really, really well in terms of getting started. Look, in terms of some of the literature and the neuroscience on like, best ways to learn. And this is again counter to what, a lot of the time there's a lot of rote learning and memorization, Diana, as you mentioned, but like practice is like a really, really effective strategy. So doing as many past questions, writing mock essays, potentially, or when they can get to the point of doing it without any notes there. Yeah, past papers, all of those things can really, really help. And then like flashcards and blurting. So that's where parents can come in. If they've got a quiz, they can write the question on one side, and then on the other, you can use Quizlet for it as well. And then parents can really help scaffold that. And it's actually a really neat way to do bonding. I find as well. I've got a student who's been working quite closely with his dad, who's I think the dad's learning as much about Russian modern history as the son. So it's a nice
Yeah.
way to do that. And then finally, just to round this out, something that I've actually applied this personally. I think this is really, really helpful of learning. It's from Professor Marty Lobdell, and it's called Study Less, Study Smart. So most students are pretty interested in the study less part, but also this hopefully the study smart. And there's actually, if we're
Yeah.
trying to learn anything new, what Professor Lobdell recommends is you open up a textbook, and let's just say it's chapter one, and you actually just simply look down at the pages and you just scroll through the pages, and you just like turn them over and just quite quickly, but your brain's probably absorbing some of the headings, maybe some of the bolded words. And so you do that, and it's built this, like, a schema or this little map in your brain. Then you go back, and then you just simply read the headings and the bolded words. And then it starts filling in the second layer of information. Then likely you go to the end of the chapter and you go read the quiz questions, because it's like, well, what are the key things that you're probably going to get learnt and assessed on? And that's the third phase. This is a fourth phase is reading the first and last sentence of every paragraph, which is probably a bit more detailed. And then the last thing is then you go and read it through fully and take notes and everything. But by that time, your brain's already programmed so much. And if you're using a Pomodoro, you've probably had breaks. And so that can be, yeah, really valuable. And just the final thing there is that it can be like when we're learning versus practicing, because they're two different things. When we're trying to absorb, or what I call like ingesting and like absorbing content,
Hmm.
having like we can only focus for so long and absorb so much. It's like a sponge, right?
Hmm.
And then you need to kind of
Mm.
like wash it all out. So just having breaks at the Pomodoro can work really well for that. So yeah, if you,
Yeah. Oh, these are great. Yeah, I love that. I love this, like reading through the book, because it reminds me of how you're priming the brain by basically like hinting at certain things, and
yeah,
then by exposing it to the different headings and the quiz questions, you're kind of feeding it a little bit. And then when you start reading, it's going to have that confirmation bias. So it's
yeah,
going to look for things that you've primed it with. I've also
yeah,
heard that before starting to read a book, look at the table of contents and read that like in detail, like thoroughly, so you get familiar with kind of the map of the book. And then I love, with students' books, obviously
yeah.
they have questions in the back and quizzes and stuff. So that's a good way to kind of, yeah, to prime the brain to look for these things. And then when you're looking at the reading, it pops out at you more and you memorize it more, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, the table of contents is very akin to the, yeah, reading and
The
scrolling through it whenever.
headings and
Yeah,
yeah.
works very neatly.
Yeah. Another question, and I wonder if you have thoughts on this. This is just anecdotal evidence, but if there's a book on audiobook and then like a regular paper book, is there like any research that shows like one way or another is better? Or I've heard that the combination of both at the same time is actually the deepest learning, but again, anecdotal evidence. I don't know if you have thoughts on that. And I don't know if students nowadays have access to audiobooks of the things that they're learning, but let's say they have to read like a book for school, like I don't know, Shakespeare or
Mm,
something. I don't know.
yeah.
If it's hard to get through it, especially if you have ADHD and it's like, if there is an
Yeah.
audiobook available, is that a good combination for learning?
I tend to find with students that the audiobooks can be really beneficial in the sense of what you've just talked about, is there's that aversion maybe to like reading it. They get assigned two, three, four books over the summer. It gets to August and they're piling up, or they're just not that excited about it. They need a break. The audiobooks can be quite a neat way to do it. And I think it would kind of come back to as well, like what's the level of absorption of reading a book from a student when it's assigned as like a text for school that you're meant to, learn, understand literary techniques and be able to analyze and everything like that. So probably a blend of both can work quite neatly. The audiobook can be a way of at least getting sure the content's done, and if it's maybe, they're not necessarily going to read it otherwise, and it might remove for parents nagging and things of that nature. I think that there is. I have read a study that there's a difference between physical books and Kindle, and this is probably confirmation bias in itself because I love physical books, but that there's
Yeah.
something about like the weightedness and like the sense touch of reading a physical book that can help with processing. But then again, you could argue on the other side that Kindle's got really brilliant things like the where you can like look up for a definition of a word you don't know and everything. So there's, that was probably stopping us from reaching for the phone or
Yeah.
reaching. So I don't know if there's a full science. It's a good question, something to
Yeah.
look
I mean, I
up.
just know like audio is a common way for adults to consume information nowadays. Um, and even as you mentioned, like reading a book, I think that can be one of those immersive experiences for students,
Yeah.
like getting into a state of flow if it's within their passion of like, if it's a topic that's within passion. Otherwise it can
Yeah.
be right, like reading physics or something. For me. Yeah, amazing. I want to make sure we address kind of if there's anything else I left out, what else would you want to bring into the conversation that we can add
Yeah,
to it?
we touched maybe a little bit on compassion, and
Mhm.
I think that it can just be a really cool concept to introduce middle schoolers and high schoolers too. And it's not always something that's in, our rhetoric or in our dialogue necessarily. And I think that, Dr. Kristen Ness, sort of the pioneer of it, and there's three kind of core constituents of it. So we've got like mindfulness, so like being aware of our emotions, even when they're uncomfortable. And secondly, we've got common humanity. So realizing like we're all in this together and that we all struggle, or like, probably refer to it as we all go through challenges or the roller coaster of life. And then that, applying that self-kindness to ourselves as well. So that can be from like, that's just like, I guess the theory of it, or like from a literature kind of definition. But there's some really cool studies on it, and it's found kind of years ago that students who are more self-compassionate like actually set mastery goals for learning, which can be really, really cool. So rather than just specifically focus on an outcome. But there's a Bluth and Malarkey study in 2018, around about 1,000 students in the US, kind of across a mix of schools, and it actually showed that students who have high levels of self-compassion, they're correlated with high levels of resilience and high levels of curiosity. So it's not necessarily causal, but I just think it's really, really neat because if, we're thinking about life and helping teenagers shift up into adulthood, that like they're going to be like, if they're practicing self-compassion, if it's associated with high resilience, I mean that's really good because we're going to all go through our own nuances and challenges and our own journey. And then the other side is that curiosity, and like that's going to help them like lean into like what lights them up and like what really, really gets them going. And that dovetails all the way back to what we talked about at the start with flow, because it can be kind of hard to find that, and we've got a world full of distractions and all these different things going on and
Yeah.
pressures and changes, and just being curious. And that's what I just love to say is like lean into just what lights you up and just try and take that first step, because that's, you never
Mhm.
know where that's going to lead you. So that's, and self-compassion can be a really good way to start there.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm all about self-compassion and include that in a lot of the resources I have. And yes, there's programs for like self-compassion for teens and kids.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the research is clear. It reduces anxiety, depression in adult studies, but probably in teens as well and kids as well. And I love this, like the curiosity requires an element of like risk taking. But if we're
Yeah.
perfectionists and we're afraid of losing control because we don't want to make a mistake as teenagers, because we don't want to be shamed for that mistake and then not belong to the group, the peer group especially, it can be scary to get curious about something that you might have a passion about, but you're too afraid of failure. So I think self-compassion is a great antidote for that, to encourage risk taking and following their
Yeah.
passions.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And there's a couple of links there because funnily enough, just back to earlier points, like curiosity and lifelong learning was a cluster of skills for the World Economic Forum as well, which is interesting. And then when you just talked about like social comparisons, and this goes into like a separate study on self-compassion by Marn and Heavey in 2022. It was in Ireland, but what it talked about is like it can actually has the potential to improve like our own concept of body image, and this was specifically done on high school students using Gilbert's compassionate mind training, and that actually talks about how like our mammalian brain is actually like primed to like look at social hierarchies and things of that nature. And so it actually educates students on that. Like this is something naturally that we're going to go on. Like, all these years ago in the savannah in Africa, if you got rejected, it was like a really, really bad thing. So it's natural to be worried about these comparisons and feeling this way. But like if you can understand that it's a more primitive element of our brain that's like facilitating that, can be quite empowering and reassuring really for teens as well.
Yes, yes. And for adults too. I mean, I think we all feel sometimes like the pressure to parent, like for parents listening to this podcast, the pressure to parent according to cultural
Mm,
expectations so that you get approval based on what's expected. It can be really hard to go against the grain. But I talk about this all the time. Like the traditional parenting method across the world is still punitive and
mm,
controlling, and so
yeah,
that's not what we're about on this podcast. So it's like we're still a minority, and if you are parenting differently and with more emotional intelligence, you are going against the grain, and some people are going to disagree with you. And again,
mm,
it's like get curious about who is this really about, you or
yeah,
them, right? Like who is this coming from, and then follow your passions, which I think in this case would
yeah,
be more mindful parenting and parenting with mental health in mind and not
yeah,
just fitting into culture, mainstream society.
yeah, exactly.
So
And I think
it's
we can
great
see
role
that.
modeling for our kids.
Yeah, we see that a lot in, US, like college admissions and things like that, like this whole like hallmark of how, it's like a measure of how you did to parent, which is just not the right benchmark really at all, right? Because every individual is going to be unique in their own special way. So yeah.
Yeah. And also self-compassion is really helpful for children with executive function challenges and ADHD and neurodiversity, particularly. It's great for all of us, but I think
Hmm.
people that are neurodiverse that do struggle academically more because of those executive function skills lagging, they really need self-compassion because it's the antidote to shame. And I know kids
Hmm.
that, again, struggle with executive function, they get shamed so much more in the school system because it's not designed, it's more designed more for neurotypical brains. And if if you aren't able to shine in that environment, you feel shame. We all would, right? And so again,
Yeah.
self-compassion as an antidote, critical to teach children. And I think we role model that first as,
Yeah.
tutors, educators, parents, any adult is a really good role model for kids about this.
Yeah. And a way for parents to actually, help bring self-compassion to life for their teens. Or I always say like to teens, like visualize yourself. Like when we were younger, we all found it difficult at one point to like tie our shoelaces or like catch a ball. Like there was this learning journey we all went on. So that can be like a way to conceptualize it. And another way I like to think about is like, how would you talk to your best friend? And this goes for us as well as adults. Like when something comes up for them, like you generally just turn to them and be like warm and positive and caring. Whereas like our voice in our own head to ourselves might be just a lot more, intense or a lot more difficult. And I think, a lot of us, myself certainly included, have been there and being quite harsh on ourselves. So,
Mhm.
helping think, is it like the critic in our mind or the coach, can be helpful. And, parents just having those conversations and helping teens think about that can be really, really useful as they start their journeys to being more self.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think for adults, it's like the inner care, like the inner friend or the critic. And I've
Mhm.
heard with young kids, particularly, I don't know if this is necessarily true for teens, but young kids, it's easier for them to think of like, what would your nice friend do, or what would say, and what would a bully say? So I
Right.
think that has to do with metacognition too, because at some point, like they develop the ability to think about thinking, and then you can talk about inner
Yeah.
critic. Like it's actually voices in your own head. There's no
Yeah.
bully, but when you're a little kid, it's like, well, what do you mean? Like which inner critic? I don't know what you're talking about, right? It doesn't make sense because of the,
Yeah. And yeah, it's funny because I guess it's theory of mind, right? And yeah, metacognition is quite linked to theory of mind. So as they start developing that, they can have theory of mind for others as well as themselves. So yeah, it all
yes.
ties back
And
together.
noticing their inner world, like there's an inner world going on in your head
Mhm.
that, like, let's not believe everything we say to ourselves, right?
Yeah, they're just
Um, yeah,
appearances.
amazing. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
I just said like they're just appearances in consciousness. Yeah, that we don't, you don't need to attach them.
Yeah. Yeah. And mindfulness obviously goes hand in hand with that, teaching kids mindfulness, but that would be a whole nother podcast. But yeah, would you share a little bit about where people can find out more about your resources? Yeah.
Yeah, so easiest way for people to find me is at manyroads.co. So that's manyroads.co. And yeah, you can find my information there, and I've got some resources as well. So yeah, that's the best way.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. I know this was really a great conversation around back to school and in this, throughout the school year for teenagers and parents of teens. And Any other kind of final last words you'd want to share with parents listening? Because there is just a lot of terrain to cover, and I think time feels like there's a crunch in parenting when you're parenting a teen. Like, it's like a countdown: 4 years left, 3 years left, 2 years left. One, like, how do I executive function, right? Like, for parents, what do I need to prioritize teaching them before they're off on their own? Any kind of final last words to kind of reassure our audience?
Well, it probably comes back to self-compassion for themselves a little bit as well. I think that
Yeah.
each student and each journey is unique, and just really appreciating that for what it is can be really, really powerful and really important. And yeah, just probably three of the key points, if I was to try and summarize it, is like, one, think about flow and try and support your team with thinking about like what really lights them up, and then what is just like the next step that they can take there. In round like metacognition and executive function scaffolding. Secondly, can just think about maybe like supporting them with that like weekly plan and that foresight, and like the calendar and diarization can be really supportive. And then thirdly, yeah, probably just the like self-compassion, having those conversations about like whether it's the visualization or whether it's the best friend versus the bully in their mind, and things like that can be really useful. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
probably.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Amazing conversation. Appreciate you taking the time today. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. It was lovely to be here. Thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks.